Good morning, everybody. Well, before I get into my formal comments, I don't see Governor Martinez, but wasn't last night just an unforgettable, remarkable evening? And now I know what she really meant about New Mexico True. That certainly was just an authentic New Mexican experience, I think, that we'll all remember for a very long time. But again, good morning to everybody and welcome back to day 2 of the summer meeting. After our taste of New Mexico culture yesterday evening, I hope everyone is well rested. Are you all well rested? I think so. And ready for another day of exploring how we can elevate the role of state leadership in the international arena. I'm excited to welcome leaders from Kenya and Germany to today's session, 2 countries NGA has not before had the opportunity to feature at an annual meeting. But first, let's talk about the work NGA has done over the past year to advance policy related to international cooperation and infrastructure. Through the 2018 Chairs Initiative, NGA equipped governors with the skills to foster and leverage innovation in energy and transportation infrastructure. And earlier this year, NGA Global launched an office devoted to international engagement and supporting governors on their global efforts. NGA chose to prioritize international cooperation and infrastructure as the need grows for governors to lead in infrastructure build-out and trade and investment. And as we saw at the 2018 winter meeting, there is substantial overlap between the two. Prime Minister Turnbull highlighted the synergy of Australia and the United States regarding infrastructure, stimulating an incredible conversation among the 6 Australian premiers and chief ministers on their unique approach to infrastructure funding. To continue that dialogue, I'm here today to introduce a fantastic leader in infrastructure, Graham Conway. Graham heads up Macquarie Infrastructure and Real Assets, an Australian company managing over $120 billion of assets. You heard that number right, $120 billion. He also represents the Global Infrastructure Investors Association, which Macquarie currently chairs. GIIA works with executives from infrastructure-focused organizations all over the world to improve stakeholder engagement and advocacy. It's no secret that the U.S. infrastructure model isn't working as well as it could. We need to shift our thinking to reimagine and reinvigorate our system at home. NGA Global has invited GIIA members and leadership, including Graham, to the summer meeting to have the conversations that will position us ahead of the curve and set us right on the right track to do just that. At Thursday's roundtable, we heard from our colleagues on what governors can do to maximize the effect of infrastructure solutions and what we can learn from other countries who have overcome similar challenges to those we are seeing today. To facilitate that discussion, please join me in welcoming Graham Conway to the stage.
Thank you, Governor.
So again, good morning, Graham. Welcome to the stage. Graham and I had the opportunity to visit privately a little bit this morning and have a conversation. I think you're really going to be pleased about what they're doing, what Macquarie is doing, what Graham is doing, what they have done throughout the world and also in the U.S. But if we could start, and if you would talk a little bit about Macquarie.
Great. Well, thank you, Governor, and thank you to the National Governors Association for having me here this morning. So Macquarie's story is relatively simple. We were established 48 years ago. We're a global financial institution, and we're proud of the fact that over that 48 years, we've had unbroken profitability. And part of the reason for that is the infrastructure business. The infrastructure business, as the Governor already mentioned, we manage $120 billion of assets under management around the world. And that really started in Australia, in Sydney, 22 years ago, where we had this very simple idea. The local government there was looking to invest in its road network, looking for the capital to do that. And we realised on the other side of the equation, there was this large pension industry in Australia growing. And those pension funds, looking at how to best invest the assets of their pensioners, were looking at where can we put that? Where is the steady, stable cash flows that are going to support the communities, to support the pensioners that are the very money we have? And it was joining together those pensioners, those pension funds, with the needs of the state government in New South Wales to invest in the roads that they were the program they'd currently initiated that led to our first infrastructure fund in Australia in 1996, which has then been a huge part of our global growth through Europe, through Asia, and certainly here in the United States and the Americas more broadly. So a long journey from that first $200 million toll road in Australia to the $120 billion of assets under management. And one of the exciting things about that journey has just been, over that period of time, the amount of interest, not just from pension funds, but from all stakeholders in all communities that want to see more investment in infrastructure. And really that's led us here today and the basis of our business, and indeed the whole industry that now is very much a deep and liquid and vibrant industry around the world.
So we had a great conversation on Thursday. What would be your takeaways with that conversation between yourself, the other entities in your space, and the governors?
Look, I think if we break it down, there was two fundamental takeaways. The first is the realisation that there is a huge amount of private sector investor interest in the United States and in United States infrastructure. I think around the table on Thursday we had investors worth $100 billion in infrastructure. I think the association as a whole represents investors with $500 billion invested across 6 continents around the world. So takeaway number one was just the amount of capital and amount of investor interest in infrastructure. Takeaway number two is then the work we all have to do to make that a reality, and a bigger reality here in the United States. Conquering those impediments, working with local stakeholders, helping with the political constraints and issues that exist that are slowing what would otherwise be a much faster rate of investment in the country.
So we referred at that meeting as all this potential capital is dry powder. Dry powder, I like that term. But in any event, we also have a lot of opportunities in the country, in the U.S. and around the globe. So what would you see as the 3 biggest challenges and the 3 most opportunities facing the infrastructure space in the U.S. today?
Okay. I guess why don't we start with the bad and move to the good. So in terms of the challenges then, I think the first challenge is what is very much the US situation, if I can describe it like that. I've been doing infrastructure for 22 years through Australia, 11 years in Europe, and here in the US for the last 6. And I think the thing that defines US infrastructure, as opposed to so many other countries around the world, is just how local it is. That around the world we see federal governments with large controls and large ownership of infrastructure assets. And that creates quite a different dialogue when, as a federal government, you're talking about an infrastructure asset here, using those benefits over here, amortizing that decision over a large populace or a large electorate. So I think the first challenge, therefore, is the very local nature of US infrastructure, and how at a state and a city and a municipal level do we work with those at that level to create a positive story around infrastructure. And that really leads me to the second challenge, which is the perception issue. I think here in the United States, there's a perception about the private sector involvement in infrastructure that we need to challenge and we need to change. We need to change that narrative completely. And as an Australian who's worked in Europe and now lives and has 2 American children, I find it staggering that this perception exists, that we have a nation where private sector involvement in pipelines, in transmission assets, in the provision of water or gas or electricity. All of us get our electricity, get our water, get our gas from our telecommunications, our Wi-Fi, from private sector owners. Yet there's still this discourse and discussion about, should the private sector own an airport? An airport's just a shopping centre. Should the private sector own a road? And we've got to look at the bigger picture, that the private sector has been working with the public sector for so long, and if we can change that perception, it must be easy to address what I've defined as challenge number 2. And I think that's really part of what Thursday was talking about, but it's the process to change that narrative. So it's not seen as bad, it's seen as good, like in all these other sectors. And that's really the opportunity too. The US market is enormous. We focus on raising, my business, we focus on raising funds to invest in US infrastructure. One third of the funds we raise come from US institutions and investors. 2/3 comes from global investors, and they want to invest in US infrastructure. So there's a huge desire for capital to come here. We've got an enormous market, and we've got an enormous opportunity. The American Association of Civil Engineers have since 1988 been producing this report card that so many of you refer to on US infrastructure. And I think the fact that in 1988 US infrastructure was rated C+, and since then every 4 years it's been rated somewhere between a D-, D or a D+, is a staggering analysis. I don't think many of us would be happy with our children coming home with that report card. But I think one of the more fascinating parts about that is it's not just the summation in total, but the engineers break it into 16 subcategories. All of those subcategories are rated D. We're talking water, we're talking aviation, we're talking schools, we're talking hospitals, every one of those categories. And so when you marry up this huge desire for capital to be investing in this economy, in this sector, with the huge need for that capital, you've just got a tremendous opportunity here, which hopefully you can tell I'm excited about, but I think the industry as a whole is really excited about making that work, which comes back to changing the narrative and that being seen as a positive.
Now, I asked you this morning, I'd ask you to share it with everybody else here, but I'd asked you about an example, a project that you've done here in the US, and you had a great one in New Jersey and New York.
Yeah, so the Goethals Bridge is the most recent public-private partnership we've embarked on, and that was building a replacement bridge from Staten Island to New Jersey, a bridge that was 80-odd years old. It had a design life of 50 years. Everyone can do the math on that. It was a little bit past its prime. And so we have just completed a project that saw the construction of a new bridge, a larger bridge, a safer bridge, and the demolition of the old bridge. We did that with a fully unionised labour force. We managed to complete the construction with a safety record that was second to none, no lost time incidences, and really have delivered, hopefully, a bridge that everyone's proud and feels safe to drive on now. Now, there was also a lot of work that went into that. There was just over a decade of approvals and permitting. So there again is both the opportunity and the reward, and something we can all work together to improve upon.
Well, let's back up again and back to the challenges. And you talked about what happened in New South Wales, and I had the privilege of being in Sydney not long ago. And there's this legacy with regard to the public owning the roads, owning the bridges. But how were they able to sell that in New South Wales in terms of convincing the public that, taking some of these legacy assets and using that cash for other things?
Yeah. I think there's embodied in that this concept of prioritisation, and we all need to be coming to the table openly on this, that the private sector isn't the answer to all ills. The private sector isn't perfect for us or provide the perfect solution to all problems. And it's about prioritising and working out, okay, where can the private sector best integrate and complement and add to a community? And what are the projects where private sector involvement can lead to success versus otherwise? The private sector is not going to be the perfect owner of a school or a park, but the private sector demonstrably has been very good owners globally of airports, of utilities, of wastewater, of telecommunications. And I think that's something around the world, not just in New South Wales, but where we see successful infrastructure projects, it's where the owners of those assets, the politicians, the regulators, have worked out what is this prioritisation, where best to take private sector involvement, private sector ownership, private sector operating expertise or capital, where best to deploy it, and then where best for we, the public sector, to be controlling and owning the story and the investment. And I think the roads in New South Wales were just an example where there was an acceptance of road ownership, of tolling actually. And so involving in the private sector in that was an easy step, if you like.
So you've got governors here at the table who may or may not be skeptical about this model. What do you tell them?
I think the really important thing for you all to take away, over and above the amount of interest there would be in the assets you own, is that you control the agenda. And this is sometimes met with looks of bewilderment as to what do I mean by that? Investors love the rule of law. It's why people want to invest in the United States rather than a host of other countries. Love the rule of law. That will get you the best and the cheapest source of capital. And you can extend that very simple concept into infrastructure. So when you sell or put an airport on a long-term lease, you don't just give the private sector the airport on a long-term lease. But why not embody that rule of law concept all around it? So put curfews on when you do or don't want flights arriving. Put carrot and sticks around fees for parking, timeliness through security, number of shops, airside, type of shops, levels of service, number of employees you want in the business, how you want those employees, the levels of employment going forward. Wrap around, I've used an airport as an example, a series of rules that can have carrots and sticks in terms of ongoing motivations to the future owners that will give you exactly what you want for your electorate, for your community, and lays it out clearly to the private sector as to what they should deliver. And the private sector loves that concept of these are the goals I've got to aspire to, these are the targets I've got to hit, I've got to keep the number of employees, I've got to meet these green targets, I've got to invest this much in the network and the facilities. That's a fantastic thing for both the private sector to be working towards, but also for the local community to celebrate when it all happens. And I think that's part of changing this narrative where instead of it being a bad story, it's like, we've involved the private sector in this asset and they're going to do all of these things and they're committed to it. And if they don't, they'll have these penalty payments or the like. And that might sound like something that's far-fetched, but it's not. The utility sector is already very good at this. The regulators around the country demand levels of service in utilities. They demand customer satisfaction. They demand minutes or hours outages or percentage outages. They demand service times at call centres. So we can embody all of these concepts, and this is what I was talking about earlier from other sectors. How do you take some of this and then put it into other assets to get the level of service, the quality of service, and meet the demands of the communities you represent? And I think that's the exciting opportunity that's got lost when we all just talk glibly about P3s. What does that mean? Right? We can really break it down and set an agenda that's much more real and gives everyone in the room and outside of the room something that they can really take away and be proud of.
And part of that public sentiment, going back to Australia, is when you did that, the policymakers used the proceeds to invest in schools and other assets. Will you talk about that?
Yeah, I think this is definitely a global issue that Electorates are suspicious of governments who receive large amounts of money. And the obvious question is, where does it go? What are you going to do with these proceeds? And I think sometimes when we're talking about private sector involvement, it's less about the private sector getting involved and it becomes more about what the body will do with the proceeds in the future, and will it just get sunk into a black hole of operating costs or what have you. I think the concept of asset recycling really just is a common sense approach to address that. And what it's really saying is, in terms of that prioritisation I was talking about, it's putting all of that on the table. So if you like, forces the local government officials to say, we are going to involve the private sector in this asset under a long-term lease or sale or what have you. And we will raise from that $1 billion to make up a number. And we are going to invest that $1 billion in these 4 new hospitals, 3 new schools, upgrade this park and build this bridge. And suddenly the narrative no longer is about, is $1 billion the right number? Has it been sold at a good price or a bad price? Will it be wasted? But the narrative becomes, wow, we're going to have the private sector involved in this airport. They're going to meet all these quality standards, deliver this higher service, and my local official has committed to invest that in my school, in my hospital, in my bridge, in my road. And there's a very easy and transparent linkage between proceeds raised, proceeds invested. Now, when you wrap around that the recycling concept that was so successful in Australia, where the federal government explicitly incentivises that to happen by saying, dear local official, if you commit to that, we'll also give you a bonus payment from the federal coffers of 10% or 20% on top, then suddenly you have a story which is, we've sold this or leased this for $1 billion, we've got $200 million as a result from the federal government, and we're investing $1.2 billion in bridges, schools, etc., that we never would have had. Suddenly you've got a story and a narrative that's really powerful in terms of infrastructure and private sector involvement.
So I don't know if you were here yesterday for our first general session, but we had a robot deliver some things up here. We had John Krychek from Waymo who talked about autonomous vehicles. So we've talked about some of these legacy projects, roads and bridges and things. But one of the things I think about with this initiative ahead of the curve is, given what's happening with technology, we're going to have to start making investments to improve the technology to match what's happening in our infrastructure. So are there opportunities there with regard to what you do?
There's absolutely opportunities, and I think I would have been here yesterday, Governor, except one of these 20-inch steam pipes burst in front of my apartment in New York, and 5 blocks were evacuated, and I had to spend yesterday morning buying some clothes and a new suit.
That worked out well. You look good.
Thank you. But this goes to the infrastructure question. It was 1930s 20-inch steam pipes running through New York City that burst and caused for nearly 50 apartments to be evacuated, and now the fears about contamination and the like are keeping those 50 apartments out of those, or the people out of those apartments for up to 7 or 8 days. So in terms of then infrastructure and technology, I think there's a huge opportunity, and this is where bringing those new ideas as to how customer service can be better, how provision of service can be faster, how we can do it a different way. There's no better way to generate and excite those ideas by a competition with involving the private sector, bringing new ideas to the table about, okay, we want a Wi-Fi network on a rail system or a subway, or we want less congestion, or we want less customer queues, or better response times. Involving the private sector in that to use technology and the process of competition to really bring to the fore the best ideas in delivering all of that. And I think that's tremendously exciting. So across our business, in terms of not just technology, but ESG as a whole, how are we investing in our assets to make all of those things better? Using GPS at our ports to get containers moving quicker, using technology and apps to get customer service in our utilities to a higher level. And I think we can use all of those ideas and processes to not just upgrade physically the infrastructure, but improve how it's used and what it's used for.
So speaking of that, how does Macquarie define a suitable investment? So when you are out there, what are the lessons learned about investment in infrastructure globally that could be applied here in the U.S.?
Yeah. So I think we get asked this question a lot, and I think we're prone to saying the easy answer and the really unhelpful answer, which is private sector and the infrastructure sector will invest in almost anything. And that leaves you no wiser than what you were half a minute ago. I think, so what does the private sector really like? That rule of law comment I made before is tremendously important. When you're looking at investing in an asset and in a community, and we might be taking a 100-year view on that asset. 50% of the value of what we might be paying might be post-year 20 or 30. And so when we're investing for that length of time, we're really looking for comfort that the framework that we're investing in will exist over that period. So having confidence in the regulatory environment, having confidence in the contracts. That doesn't mean everything has to be locked down, but the framework by which it will be determined over the next 100 years. That's really important to us. And I think we can sometimes overlook just how powerful that is. When you're talking about those pension funds representing pensioners, that's exactly what they want, that confidence that there's that contractual surety, that framework in place for the long term. And then when you get down into the specifics, there really is so many buckets of private sector capital that whether it's a low-risk contracted pipeline through to a higher risk greenfield development process, there is private capital for all those different sorts of risks. And so one of the things we always say is, if you're serious about embarking on a larger scale process by which you're involving the private sector, think about establishing those frameworks or a P3 office like perhaps Virginia has, where you get that centre of excellence, where you get all of that knowledge, where you can use it over different sectors and really start to understand what are the risks, what's the sort of capital that we'll be wanting to invest in that, and how best to access that, and then manage a process to deliver it. In the end, we love investments that are steady, stable cash flows. We love investments that are going to be there as long as the community's going to be there. We love investments that are have a risk related to the local or overall national economy, the GDP, locally or nationally. So, as I said, Governor, we can be incredibly unhelpful by saying we'll invest in anything. I think the key message would be marrying up those specific risks early on in any process, so that on your side, eyes are wide open about the sort of capital that would want to be invested there. And on our side, we can give honest feedback as to how liquid or deep that market is, how expensive or otherwise or cheap it will be, and whether those expectations about risk transfer are getting married up.
Well, let's talk about something a little more specific and move to renewable energy. So in Nevada, in the past 7 years, we've installed about $7 billion of renewable energy projects, solar, geothermal, wind, battery storage is becoming a big component as well. Is that something that Macquarie is going to be looking at?
Absolutely. I think over the last 2 decades, every year we've just seen more and more interest in the social context or framework under which we invest. Those pension funds I've talked about, that make up 2/3 of the capital coming into our industry, they want to see not just they want to see good investing, and green energy is a huge part of that. So the desire to see not just renewable investment projects made, but also to green credentialise, to green invest existing assets is tremendously powerful. In Washington State, where we've been the proud owners of Puget Energy for the last decade, and we've worked with Governor Inslee and the team there to really meet the state's objectives with the utility and what we're doing with Puget. Now, Puget's more than just a green utility, but we've invested heavily in making it greener and better going forward. So I think you'll see us and our peers not only wanting to specifically invest in the renewables projects you have in your state, as you mentioned, but also to make greener the existing investments they have. And I think that's a tremendously exciting part about what the private sector is incredibly motivated to do by virtue of its stakeholders, the pension funds that sit behind it.
All right, well, thank you. I'm going to open it up to governors for questions. Governors, do you have any questions? Yes, Governor Walker.
Thanks, and thanks for addressing us here today. I had two questions, but one you kind of answered when you talked about, kind of what a state could do to make P3s more attractive, and you talked about stability and rule of law and that. The other part, I guess I would ask for a lot of us my state, for example, is urban, suburban, and rural, and I get in an urban area in each of our states across America where a P3 is attractive because you have high volume, but when you get to rural areas, how can you make P3s work there? Because there's certainly not the return on investment. I know you mentioned the private sector, for example, with broadband is a good example in our state. We're actually helping the private sector because they can't get an ROI on expanding. Now, they can operate once they do, but I'm thinking about other things we can do in roads, bridges, other infrastructure where it makes it more attractive in rural areas, because urban areas are pretty self-apparent, but rural seems to be a bit of a challenge when it's on the return on investment.
Thanks, Governor. I think that's a great question, and it's a very pertinent question, and it ties into, I think, perhaps some of my opening remarks about the key takeaways from the discussion on Thursday, which is the local impediments. And when a lot of infrastructure is controlled at a federal level or a state level, the use of proceeds in an urban environment and monetising those assets with the private sector and then recycling or reallocating that capital into the rural areas is much easier. And that's, I think, what we see around the world, and that's one of the concepts embodied in recycling, that you're taking money from one area and you're putting it in another. And the truth of the matter is that infrastructure is most economic in densely populated urban areas. That's where you get that amazing equation of patronage or usage per mile or diameter or whatever the measure is. So that's where it's tremendously powerful, and I think that is part of the dialogue as to how to make infrastructure investing, the involvement of the private sector, a more compelling story here in the United States. How do we help you in your state monetize or bring in the private sector in the urban areas, and how does that get recycled into those rural areas? And again, that prioritisation I talked about as to where you involve the private sector, it's not just by sector. And my examples were by sector of, private sector is not great for schools or parks, but perhaps better at utilities and airports. But it can be about region too. The private sector will be more compelling because it's more economically viable in the urban area. How does that money then get reallocated to the rural area? That is immensely complicated when the ownership of those assets isn't at a state level, but it's at a municipal level. So how do you get it from one municipality to the other? And I think the interesting point then is, again, it's a source of capital. So how does the private sector help one municipality raise money or fund other areas in that municipality such that funds at a state level can be freed up for those rural areas? And I think that's just part of the dialogue and discussion that has to happen, so that kind of honesty about where the need is, where private sector's best, can be had. From my perspective, having been working in infrastructure for 20 odd years, it seems to go quite quickly. And having these open discussions such that you can plan is tremendously important. What we'd like to see nothing more of is us and our competitors being appreciated by you and the community. And for that to happen, there has to be a really honest discussion about how those proceeds are used, where they're invested, how those projects become successful so that people have the comfort and the confidence to keep involving the private sector. And I've talked big numbers. It doesn't mean the private sector will only invest in your state for multi-billion-dollar projects. The private sector is very happy to invest in much smaller areas as well, much smaller projects to develop that trust, to build that relationship such that not just the politicians but the community will be confident handing the keys or involving the private sector in the larger projects as well.
Thank you, Governor Walker. Questions from other governors? I suppose I have another one to add is, I feel like we've been using this old model for a very long time, and we have to start thinking outside of the box because we have less funds available to build more complex infrastructure projects. And I know that there are some projects in my state that they're telling me we won't be able to afford for 15, 20 years. You talked about a bridge that was well beyond its useful life. So I suppose, what is the one key message about infrastructure? And I know you've touched on this during our conversation today, but what is that key message about infrastructure, given that I think, I don't want to speak for all the states, but that we have less funds on the roads, we have electric vehicles, we have higher mileage, better mileage cars, so there's less money coming in via gas taxes. At the same time, we have more usage than we've ever had. People are driving cars more than they ever had. What do you tell everyone?
I'd say this. As I hope you've heard over the last few days, there's a huge amount of interest investing in infrastructure in the United States, in all your states. That is local money, that is global money. So there's a huge amount of capital there that wants to work with you. The key message for you is you control absolutely and undeniably how that capital gets used. So you get to control and define on which projects to involve the private sector. And if I could leave you with the one key message in all of that, as part of controlling that, you get to ask for everything you want. So if you want to involve the private sector and have targets about future employee levels, future renewable levels, future green levels, future service standards, future restrictions, future growth targets, future capex, future investment, future community projects, you get to define all of that. And if I could encourage you to take that way and think about that as to how involving the private sector in those projects which you own, which you control, which you have the agenda for, and doing it in a way that meets a whole host of social requirements and political objectives for your local communities, I think that's a tremendously exciting way and a positive way to see the involvement of the private sector in infrastructure. That puts it firmly in your hands as to what you can demand when the private sector comes in, that it doesn't have to be seen as a bad thing. It should be seen as a remarkably positive thing because you're defining what the private sector will do for your community. And I think that narrative in itself starts to make private sector involvement in infrastructure a great thing rather than something that sometimes people say very quickly because they're not quite sure if it will be good politically or good for their communities. It's something to embrace, it's something to be demanding of, and I think it can be a powerful message for you all in terms of what you can do for your states, for your communities.
Graham, thank you. Any other questions from our governors? Governor Carney.
Yeah, just a quick question. What's the argument for doing these projects in the private sector, in partnership with the private sector, when we as states and public sector can always borrow the money more cheaply? I
would say that if you have an asset that doesn't require operational excellence, that you don't want to grow, you don't want innovative solutions, then you should continue to finance it through the municipal bond markets and those financing alternatives you have. But if you want to encourage new ideas, new growth, new opportunities, revenue lines that you haven't yet imagined, that's when the private sector as a source of capital becomes immensely competitive vis-a-vis all the alternatives you currently have at hand. And that's why I use airports as the great example, because the private sector will come in and they'll look at that airport as to how they can get people through security quicker, how they can offer more shopping, how they can offer better services. And that vision and the investment to achieve that then becomes how they demonstrate value to you and your community.
So are there opportunities that your company sees around the world or your bank sees around the world that we're missing here in the U.S.?
Look, I think when we look at infrastructure globally versus in the United States, what do we see? There's huge private sector involvement in the energy sector, whether it's electricity, gas, power, upstream or downstream. Huge private sector involvement and huge acceptance of the private sector. The big difference we see versus other countries and around the world is the lack of private sector involvement in transport. And that really applies not just to roads and to bridges, but also to the airport sector. And I think one of the things we'd be most excited about for the future of infrastructure investing in this country is the aviation market's huge here. The power to upgrade and revolutionise the airports around the country is very real, turning airports into something where you want to go early to have dinner before you catch a flight and do a bit of shopping, rather than something you begrudgingly go early to because you're not sure if the security line will get you through to your flight in time. And that's the sort of thing where we'd look at, where we genuinely believe our sector could make changes such that people see that airport, see the changes that happen, and communities around the country want that to be replicated in their own communities, that they want to see that involvement of the private sector to make the airports a better experience. And I just think that's a very real and fantastic example of where so much value could be added and released and reinvested in other projects, rural or otherwise, around your good states.
Governor Bevan.
Quick question. I'll catch up with you after about things you're doing in Kentucky. I won't bore everyone with that now. But I'm just curious, and it's difficult. It's like picking a favorite child, perhaps. But if you had to single out one or two premier projects that you've been involved with anywhere in the world, but certainly ideally in the country, in the U.S., what might those be? And what would be the reasons that they would come to mind as being the perfect example of what a win-win looks like here?
I think we've been involved in a number of airports and around the world, and I think just as a passenger, when you walk through that airport a number of years after we've first taken ownership, and it's quicker and faster and the options around shopping and food are visibly better, I'm taking off my investor hat or my ownership hat, and just as a user of the airport, I'm going, well, this is great. This is a visibly better experience than it ever has been in the past. And I think airports, as I've already said, allow for that. Sydney Airport was a great example in that context. I think in the utility context, it's slightly different because the service or that visibility of impact it's much reduced. The pipes are underground or the wires are underground. But we've also been investor in utilities where we've doubled or trebled the size of the asset base over a 10-year period because we've invested in improving those systems. So many utilities are 80 or 100 years old, and investing money to improve water leakage or improve quality service leaves you feeling afterwards, okay, well, the community now has an asset that's 100 years new rather than 100 years old. And that's harder to see. The service or the quality levels are kind of people forget in terms of the provision of electricity or the quality of water or the lack of wastage coming out of that. But that leaves you proud when you've owned an asset for a decade and seen those improvements that are literally underground, except you know they've been made.
All right, well, that brings us to our conclusion. If you would all please join me in thanking Graham for a great session.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Graham.
So at this time, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and I'm going to really stick to the 10 minutes so we can hear from our international friends. Thank you.
Leave them lights as they are and keep your clothes on. I've had more than my fill.
Ladies and gentlemen, if I could please respectfully ask you to take your seats. And now it is my great distinction, honor, and privilege to introduce the Honorable Governor Nanook. If you haven't already heard, we have more than 40 Kenyan governors, lieutenant governors, and senators joining us for this year's summer meeting, and welcome. It really is a pleasure to have you here with us to join us at the summer meeting. The Kenyan Council of Governors, which is similar to NGA, aims to learn from our models of federalism and approaches to policy. At the National Governors Association, it is rooted in our goal to share best practices. We are thrilled to extend this principle to another country and have a delegation so closely aligned with our mission here today. Governor Nanook is the chair of the Council of Governors and leads the delegation. He is the current governor of Turkana. Yes? County. Prior to serving as governor, he served as a member of parliament, deputy minister of forestry and wildfire, and held several senior positions within the United Nations. Please join me in welcoming Governor Nanook to the stage.
Excellency Governors, members of NGA, all invited guests, it's my pleasure to address you today on behalf of the Kenyan delegation of about 45. In that delegation, we have 23 governors and deputy governors. We also have our CEO of the Council of Governors, 3 senators who sit in the Senate, the control of budget, and deputy cabinet secretary representing the national government, and a host of so many other officers from our legislature and from our executives. We've been here since Monday. On the invitation of the NGA, and I want to thank Governor Sandoval and Scott Pattison for that invitation. It is the second one where we've come. This is only the first biggest delegation, because in a Kenyan constitution, the Kenyan constitution borrows heavily the system of governance that is existing in Kenya. So we thought that this visit will be useful for us to be able to learn from a system that has been there for so many years. We've only been functional the last 6.5 years. Essentially, to learn how you run the state governments, the workings of the state governments, your engagement with the private sector. We've been observing that since yesterday, and we've learned quite a lot, so that we can be able to build a partnership for the future, a partnership that's going to be mutually beneficial to both the United States and Kenya. Kenya has a long history of engagement with the United States through the WTO rules, but also through various agreements that we've entered in various sectors: defense, health, trade, education, etc. And over the last couple of years, we've had agreements that have more or less benefited both countries in the sectors of health, energy, trade, particularly the African Growth Opportunity Act, which has enabled African countries, including Kenya, to be able to trade easily and be given incentives to be able to bring their goods into the United States. it's only last month, on the 29th June, that a renewed agreement, MOU, was signed between the United States government and the Kenya government that is touching on certain key areas of priorities for Kenya, which we call the Big Four. And these are the areas of food security, manufacturing, health, and affordable housing. So the agreement also further goes into more engagement with the United States government in the areas of manufacturing, infrastructure development, clean energy and renewable energy, the digital economy, and all other areas, including mining, the entire area of the extractives, mining and oil. So what we've learned from here, and essentially that is fitting into the priorities for Kenya government, and the priorities for Kenya government is also the priorities of the 47 subnational governments, is essentially that the NGA's key focus is 5: economic opportunities, health, education, homeland security and public safety, and environment, energy, and transportation. Essentially, this matches very well with the priorities that we ourselves in Kenya are focusing on. And we think this is an area where we can be able to add ourselves synergies, particularly with the strength that you have. And we've seen through the engagements, the sort of high-level discussions you are having that is going to be benefiting us much more. We have also seen that your engagement with the industry, private sector industry, over the yesterday and this morning is so very close. And it gives the opportunity for industry that leads in innovation and in what it does best to be able to contribute to the public good, which governors are key to them. And we think that this is something we've borrowed, and this is something that we can be able to take back and be able to put in those quality engagements. The other takeaway is the NGA established Best Practice Center. And of course, the best practice projects that we've seen being presented here. And I think to us, this is a very big lesson that we will take back with us. And we also learned that you're also looking at lessons learned from other countries to be able to improve your own, but also best practices within the states of what one state does better that can benefit all the others. And I think that is the essence of the Council of Governors, to be able to benefit both within ourselves, but also benefit from governments and subnational governments that have done this very well before. I think we learned that the examples were being given of Switzerland and Germany, where they've had a much better system that integrates the youth into the job environment through the trainings and that system. And I think this is very useful. We've also learned the matter on government role in growing state economies. That the governor must at all be able to understanding not only the workings of the state economy, but the entire global economy, because that's where the market that's where the leverage is for the competitiveness of your state. And I think this is important for us, because when we began our journey of setting up our subnational governments, the politics in our country was saying, governor, stick in your state. What are you doing outside your state? I think we learned that this engagement outside helps us be able to do much better. Biggest takeaway is that we've got to build relationships. I know there's a lot your states can be able to benefit from Kenya. There's also a lot of benefit from us from your state. So we do hope that the engagement we've begun can be able to be taken forward. We hope with NGA we're going to be discussing, and particularly looking at the agreement that the US government and Kenya government has done, so that we can relook at it and see what sort of areas between the Council of Governors and NGA can be able to collaborate on. And I hope that we can be able to engage on this moving forward. And finally, I want to thank Governor Sandoval. I also want to thank Governor Bullock and Scott Martin and all the governors we engaged with yesterday and the day before yesterday. And we hope that this engagement is going to prosper and we can be able to match the various states here, the various counties in Kenya, and to see what advantages they can be able to gain from each other. I know quite a significant number of countries here are in Kenya. They are the source of the apparels, they are the source of the macadamia nuts that come in here, they are the source of several other things that the US government imports from Kenya, and we hope that we can be able to build that synergy to provide you a market back home, but also for us to get a market here for the produce that we are producing. And most important is for us to be able to learn from you and to be able to improve how we deliver public good for the people of Kenya. So I want to thank you once again for hosting us, particularly the host governor, Governor Martinez, and we hope that we will come back again here. And we normally organize two particular meetings for Council of Governors. One is a governors meeting, we do it regularly, but every end of the year in April, we celebrate what we call devolution in Kenya, because this is something new, it's not been there, and the next year, we hope we can be able to invite the NGA to come and give us an address and during that period. So thank you so much, Governor Sandoval, for this opportunity of addressing you, and we hope that we will have a much better collaboration moving forward. Thank you.
Governor, thank you, and you're an inspiration to all of us and to the delegation again. Welcome. I look forward to our collaboration and working together and learning from one another. It is a great honor that you've joined us here today. Now, I have the great honor of introducing our final speaker of the morning, General Secretary Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. She is the Deputy Leader of the Christian Democratic Union and former Minister President of the German state of Saarland. As a respected party leader and up-and-coming force in German national politics, the General Secretary has experienced both leading a German state and a national party. Germany and the United States have been linked through centuries of shared history. From the communities of German immigrants and their descendants spread throughout our 50 states, to the hundreds of thousands of jobs created in the U.S. through companies such as Volkswagen and Adidas, American ties to Germany are strong. Germany also remains an important trade and investment partner. In 2015, the total trade relationship was $174 billion. In the entire United States, German companies are the third largest foreign employer. It is clear here why the U.S. continues to value our transatlantic relationship. NGA has always stressed the importance of our subnational leaders and the continued dialogue between different countries. I speak for all the governors here in saying, General Secretary, thank you for coming across the Atlantic to speak with us today. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to the General Secretary. General Secretary.
Honorable Governor Sandoval, Honorable Governors, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you today. I would like to thank Scott Pattison for making this possible. Thanks a lot. This is my first international visit in my new role as General Secretary of the Christian Democrat Union. For me, it was very important to travel to the United States, especially in a time when our transatlantic partnership is experiencing a certain stress test. And for me, as a former two-term governor, it was especially important to join the NGA summer meeting. The stress test I mentioned is about the differences between our two national governments. The last 2 days in Washington, D.C., we talked about defense and the danger of crushing the NATO, a trade surplus, and a possible trade war, even using the expression foe. We do it in a manner that was, in my opinion, not a good manner to talk between partners having different interests, but common values. And so it is important to strengthen our partnership as a network made of personal relationships, exchanges and cooperations in economy, science, and so on. Ladies and gentlemen, before I became General Secretary of the CDU, I was governor of the state of Saarland, a tiny state located in the heart of the Western Europe at the French border. A state, as a former industrial region of coal mining and steel production, a region worked hard on a successful economic transition process. Now we are the third place about automotive issues, one of the best places in Germany, in Europe, and also in an international view of computer science, of cybersecurity research, and of artificial intelligence. So my home country is linked in different ways to the European issues as well as in the transatlantic relationship. People in my state having not so much interest in discussions between national governments. They want jobs, a good education system for their children, health care and security for their retirement. They want a strong policy working against crimes and creating security. They want what we call a good life. And there I see absolutely no differences to the wishes of American people. So we have a lot in common in the political issues we have to deal with. The United States and the European Union have created over the years the largest and wealthiest market in the world. 45 of 50 US states export more to the European Union than they do to China. German companies have invested $373 billion into the United States. They are willing to invest more. German companies have created 800,000 jobs in the US states. These are good jobs, mainly in industry and manufacturing. Most of these jobs are unionized. BMW in South Carolina, which I will visit on Monday, is the biggest exporter of cars made in the US states. US companies such as Ford, General Electric, McDonald's, Hewlett-Packard and others are very present in the German market and employed around 700,000 people. The United States and the European Union are responsible for almost the half of the global GDP and almost 2/3 of all foreign direct investments. This is a very solid foundation for practical cooperation in the benefit of our people, independent from our national governments. Dear friends, my father was as a soldier in the World War II. He was only 17, 18 years old when he was shot and wounded by a soldier of the US Army. But this US Army saved his life, took care of him, gave him the experience of forgiveness, of values such as respect and human dignity. We have to discuss honestly our differences, and we have to find a better balance of interest and of burden sharing. But we should do this knowing and respecting our shared values and in the sense of a practical partnership that benefits both sides. Thank you for your attention.
General Secretary, thank you for your remarks, and again, welcome to Santa Fe, New Mexico. We had an opportunity to become introduced a few moments ago. Do you have any thoughts about Santa Fe?
Yeah, that's my the first situation that I'm here in Santa Fe. It's a wonderful place. It's great to be here. I wish I had a little bit more of time to see all of this great place.
Well, thank you. So, what do you see? As I point to my my fellow governors, what the governor's role should be in fostering the foreign relationships and initiating collaboration with German ministries and to share best practices regarding innovation, infrastructure, and workforce development?
I think that we have to deal with common challenges. The challenges of how we can remain our jobs, our economic strength in a digitalization, in artificial intelligence. We have to work together on the issues of workforce to get more and better jobs for young people. We have to exchange our experiences about healthcare and other issues. I think that on the level of the federal states here in the United States and of the Bundesländer in Germany, we had a lot of common, and this is, in my opinion, a good basis to recreate and to strengthen our friendship and the transatlantic partnership.
Now, during your remarks, you talked about what our citizens want: better education, better health care, stable job, stable retirement. My initiative as the chair of the National Governors Association is to be what we call ahead of the curve and the innovation governors. Are you seeing that happen in Germany, where you have individuals that need different types of training and getting the youth into the workforce?
Yeah, that's a good question, because on the federal states or on the Bundesländer in Germany, we are responsible for the education system. We are responsible for that what you called workforce, and we are responsible to deal with the question: how can we make a better education on the challenge of digitalization? How must we build our schools, our school system? What issues have we to deal with? And this have just a little to do with the national level. This is the work that the federal states have to do, and I think there are a lot of common experiences that we can share together.
So, what's an example of how you're doing that? How are you addressing that skills gap?
That's not so easy in Germany, because in a certain way we have to deal with with the situation that each federal state work on its own, and to put this in a certain way in a national common program. But the main issue is what will it mean for school education? How we have to change what we are teaching in our schools? What are the skills to get successful people for the future? People that have it's possible to have responsibilities in a digitalization world, and this is in the current very difficult discussion between the federal states in the United States. And we see that there are other parts in the European Union, in other parts in the world like China, that have a huge dynamic on these issues. And we are, in my opinion, we are a little bit too, we worked a little bit too slowly in Germany. And so it's interesting for me to learn on these days how the federal states here in the United States will deal with these challenges.
So you did your time as a minister president, which is essentially equivalent to being a governor. Do you have a group like the National Governors Association where the minister presidents come together and share best practices?
Yeah, we call it the Ministerpräsidentenkonferenz. Is a little bit similar, like the NGA. We have the chairman for 1 year. I was this in 2017, and there are several meetings in around 1 year. In the spring, a meeting that goes around in the federal states. And in the winter session, there is a national meeting in Berlin. And there is the play with issues of security. There is the place we come together with the national government, with the chancellor, to talk about how we can deal with questions and issues of migration, of integration, especially for asylum seekers and refugees, what is a huge challenge in Germany today, but not also in Germany, also in the entire European states.
You used the word challenge. What would you say are your biggest challenges back home?
Yeah, we have a special structure of economic forces in Germany. We are a very industrialist region, and we have to deal a lot with issues of automotive, and so the new developments of digitalization, of using the artificial intelligence, of electromobility, and so on. It's a huge challenge for us on level of the question: how can we stabilize our economic situation? How can we stabilize our jobs that we have created in the past? And this is a huge challenge in the politics, in the economic politics, and we have to deal with a rising front of populism in our country, in the European countries, populism from far right, from the far right side of far right populism, but also of far left populism, and this is nowadays a topic that is that influenced in a very intensive way the political debates in Germany, but also in other European countries.
Now, prior to listening to Governor Nook, we had a panel on infrastructure and the challenge that we have here in the U.S. in our respective states associated with aging infrastructure. Do you have a similar challenge in Germany?
Oh yeah, we have to recreate our infrastructure in a traditional way, our streets, our bridges, and so on. And on the same time, we have to create new infrastructure that we have that is necessary to deal with digitalization. And I didn't know how it is here in the United States, but in Germany we have a huge problem with bureaucracy, and we are in a very complicated way to say, okay, we can do this and this, and we do it, in my opinion, in a way that is too slow. And this is at the moment a big issue that we have to deal with.
Well, thank you. I wanted to open it up to our fellow governors to see if any of them have any questions for the General Secretary. Governors, any of you have any questions? I do. I have some more, but I want to make sure that. So we, you know, given that you're a global leader in automobile production, we had conversation last summer with Elon Musk about autonomous vehicles, and I had a conversation with a gentleman who's the CEO of Waymo, which is a Google company that is developing autonomous vehicles. Is that an issue that you're dealing with in Germany?
Yeah, absolutely, because this is for us giving great changes for the future, and that is something we have in common, yeah.
And then associated with that, you mentioned EVs, the electric vehicles. Is that something that you're seeing a change in with regard to your auto industry?
Yeah, it's a slow changing, because we are very good in the traditional ways to build a car. And so we have to deal with a certain development that is in a way that we don't crash the jobs that we have today. And it's a big issue that we are discussing with on the political level, but also on the level and the enterprises between the unions, and so I think that we will have for the future, and we will remain a certain mixture between e-mobility and traditional ways.
Now, I mentioned to you previously when we were introduced that I had the privilege of leading a trade mission to Germany not long ago, and I was overwhelmed and incredibly impressed with your workforce development. Frankly, we used a lot of what we learned to introduce that to Nevada, but also while I was there, I saw that there was a big focus on renewable energy, particularly wind energy, and seeing that. Is that something that you're developing in Germany and expanding the renewable energy?
Yeah, that is a sector that is increasing in a very dynamic way. It's not so easy. You mentioned the wind force. It's not so easy in Germany because we have not so large places to put it on, the wind forces and windmills, and so there is a certain resistance of citizens. But we have a strong increasing of wind power, of green powers, and in my opinion it's absolutely necessary because we have to deal with certain climate change, and we hold on to that what we have negotiated in Paris.
Now, has your experience as a minister president, helped you now in the way you lead in the federal government?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I think as a governor or minister president, you have to deal with a lot of issues that are influencing the common people in the daily life sense. And we have a system, a mixture in Germany between national level and federal level with strong interdependencies between the two political levels. And now I think that it's for me a great experience, that's what I have made in the last couple of years, that I can bring with me on the national level, and it helps me to make my work in the CDU, give me a lot of experiences and personal relationships with a lot of leaders in our national party.
And our time is almost up, but governors, any other questions that you might have for the General Secretary? Yes, Governor Bevin.
Just one quick question. You mentioned renewables. You mentioned, some of the difficulties just given land mass and resistance from folks. But back in 2015, it was a brutal winter. There were difficulties with energy generation, and there seems to have been a little bit of a return to the idea that if there's to be any kind of independence of energy in Germany, that some of the more traditional fossil fuel-based production, including coal, which was from a region you represented, would have to come back to the forefront more than people might wish or want, but that the bridge to whatever the energy future looks like is certainly going to be built of coal for some period of time. Can you talk about that? Is that something people have understood of necessity, or just something that they appreciate beyond the immediate need?
No, we talked about this because in our history we have one historical situation in the 70s where we depend in a very strong way on oil from Arabia, and since then we try to make a certain diversification of our energies. And the great challenge in Germany is that we have a strong need of energy that is all times available. And that is the great issue and the great challenge with green energy. And so we try to develop a certain mixture between green energy, between less coal because of its difficulties to the climate change, but more gas. We discussed it in the current situation. But what we have decided, and not will turn this back, is that we will leave the energy of nuclear power plants. That is decided. It is difficult because we have not only a separated national system. We have a system that is independent to the other European countries. And so we have to deal with this question not only on a national level, but also on the European level.
Yes.
It makes it not easier.
Any other further questions? Well, General Secretary, thank you for coming so far. We look forward to enhancing and strengthening the relationship between the U.S. governors and Germany. We really appreciate your comments and truly look forward to working with you. Please join me in thanking the General Secretary.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. The international portion of our program, we are now going to break for lunch at the Smart States Pavilion. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you.